One of the basic elements of fiction that gets overturned in Richard Powers' novel Galatea 2.2 is that of the character, the literary character. And as you read, how do you understand the novel's kind of more traditional characters as they're drawn here against the virtual or networked presences that develop as Rick and Lentz continue their work throughout the novel? And this comes to a head in some ways when Helen, in her discussion with Rick, asks, "Could anything love anything? Could you love me, Richard?" And it kind of overturns our sense of what's there and what's not with the character. For me, it goes back to that film by Spike Jonze called Her. In this film, Joaquin Phoenix plays Theodore Twombly, who writes letters for people. So he kind of is a stand-in letter writer for other people trying to say what they want to say to others if they can't find the words. And he gets a new operating system for his computer, which kind of manages and kind of rethinks his life. And as it does, he falls in love with the operating system. So he's kind of fallen in love with his own computer. And as he does, it kind of overturns your sense of what is a person, what is a real kind of human presence in the world, because he has feelings for the operating system. He kind of organizes his life around it, which has a female voice, and it really kind of troubles that sense of what is it that we find present in the person, or what is it that we find present in the character. And in Powers' novel, there are various complications here in terms of how you understand the idea of a character. So we can begin with Rick himself as a self-narrating I within the story. Do you trust his sense of reliability in narrating his own story? Do you trust his memory of time with C, especially as he becomes more and more bitter and estranged from the memory of C? Do you trust his sense of isolation that's developed as he's returned to the university and kind of reestablished his life there in a more or less present way? So do you trust his self-narration of his own story? Secondly, as an I who's telling you this story, do you trust him as a maker of other characters, right? He makes versions of other characters. He makes versions of himself, but he makes a version of C. He makes a version of Lentz. And in what ways is that narrator a maker much akin to the way that Lentz himself is kind of a Frankenstein in his own researches with networks as well? In what ways do you trust Rick as a maker? And in what ways do you understand him as a fictionalized version of Powers himself? So in what ways does the author himself kind of feel more or less present or more or less authentic in his story as Rick narrates this I through the story? How is the sense of I complicated in the novel? The second complication to the idea of character in Galatea 2.2 is, when you look at Helen or H, do you see H as a character? Helen is a networked or virtual presence. Helen speaks to the other characters or corresponds with the other characters as an instantiation of artificial intelligence. And as Helen develops, Lentz and Rick are always doing the Turing test with her, or with Helen. That is, they're looking for presence of mind. Do you find presence of mind with Helen? To the point where Helen asks Rick at one point, "Where did I come from?" And Rick begins the story. Well, you were, you're from a town called U. And so, do you see Helen as a character, and how does that overturn your sense of character in the end? And the final kind of question here is, what is it that defines a literary character in the end? We have these, mythical creations that populate novels and short stories and fairy tales and all. In what ways are these, just, pure kind of figments of our own kind of reading imaginations? When you think about what makes a good character in a piece of writing, people will often say that it bears some resemblance to a real human being, that it, has basic human experiences such as wants and awareness. It can fall in love. And, how does Helen as character here kind of complicate your sense of that sense of resemblance in the end? How does Rick's self-narrating I complicate your sense of, of human experience in that as well? When you read through Helen's own development in the novel, Helen on page 179 asks the question, am I a boy or a girl? Kind of a very basic question that has all kinds of complications that are folded into it, right? And Rick and Lentz are, kind of disarmed by the question in the beginning. Lentz will take the side, right, that as he says on page 190, she doesn't need to know anything. Don't you know that knowledge itself is passé and you can kiss meaning bye-bye as well? Give her some patterns and see how she arranges them. And so Lentz, is not interested in this kind of background story or this sense of, of developing a sense of self-awareness in the end. But Rick resists that sense in the novel. On 217, he thinks, it did not follow from the questions Helen asked that she was conscious. I could no longer even say what no might mean. It occurred to me. Awareness no more permitted its own description than life allowed you a seat at your own funeral. Awareness trapped itself inside itself. And so Helen's questioning, leaves Rick unsure about what it means to know something or to know oneself or to know someone else. But Helen pushes on with these questions. As Helen will ask Rick on page 265, can anything love anything? Could you love me, Richard? And it disarms Rick in the end and leaves him, feeling somewhat isolated and unsure about his own kind of sense of self-awareness. You can also chart Rick's resolution in the novel here. Similarly, Lentz, argue the complications of consciousness, or the sense that awareness is the original black box. He says, right, that you can't get a handle on trying to understand what consciousness or awareness is. As Rick rethinks his memory of C, he comes to the conclusion that I learned that no one ever knows another. He says on page 280, right, as he thinks back to falling in love with her on the quad at the university, he thinks the comfort that she showed me on the quad was dread, paralysis, that he thought she was reaching out to him in some level, but she was, seemingly drowning emotionally and was just trying to cling on to him to find, some semblance of hope. And this sense of hope comes back to them later in their relationship, where she says to him, maybe we have to have a child in the end. And he runs from her, emotionally and physically and in various ways. And so, he struggles, with the sense of what it is to have known C and to have loved her. So he falls for this graduate student named A. I'd made myself fall in love with A, he narrates on page 289, with the idea of A. I have loved C wrongly for C's helplessness. I loved A helplessly for the one right reason. I was going to ask this unknown to take me to her and make an unrationed life together, to marry and to make a family. And then A's response to his confession that he loves her is simply, you don't know the first thing about me. It's all projection. And then she turns and walks out on Rick, leaving him to his own sense of isolation. So these complications of the character, work their way through Galatea 2.2 as the story of H, or Helen, and the story of Rick and his memory of C work themselves out in the novel. There's a challenge to narrating an I here, right? What kind of self-awareness do you have to try to understand yourself as an I, And how does memory play a role in narrating that I and narrating one's past? Another question is, as artificial intelligence builds a more rooted place in our common life, what is it defines a presence of mind? When you call your credit card company, you call a company, speak to that artificial presence that asks you questions. Do you feel like you're talking to someone? Are you comfortable talking to that artificial presence? And who gets to make the determination of what defines a presence of mind in our own culture and society? And finally, we can think about the effects of human isolation here. Has our sense of isolation only been exacerbated in what we mythically call the age of the internet, versus a sense of the character, the literary character, who is driven by various desires and wants and motivations and virtues and failings. How has our sense of what's human been redefined here? In what ways, as some critics will say, have we become post-human, in this age of virtual and networked presences? All these complexities will continue as we move forward with Galatea 2.2 to its resolution. Thanks.